team, I wanted to make a quick video. I just made a video about a romance series that I was reading that was kind of flipping the script and changing the narrative in way of romance. And it was kind of talking about confidence versus vulnerability and knowing your power and things like that. And so I kind of want to make a video talking not about power, but about vulnerability in regards to power. Just because, growing up, I was very shy and I was very quiet, and I had an opinion, and I was firm in my opinion. But I oftentimes would sit back and I'd watch and I'd listen, versus sharing that opinion. And so I now, I listened to a lot, and I kind of watched a lot, and I saw a lot of the dynamics going on in like different, miscellaneous classrooms and what have you, and just, the world in general, I guess. But I was in mock trial. And so I know that kind of helped shape my opinion of vulnerability, I think, just because in it, I oftentimes would play the defendant. For mock trial, they put on a fake trial, and you have defendants, and you have the defenders, and you have the prosecutors, and you put on a trial, and so you hear the witness testimony, you go over the affidavits, so you can kind of script the testimony to get to kind of show your truth to, who the powers that be, either the judge or the witness stand or whoever. But you look at the narrative, you see the facts that are presented to you, you see the evidence that's presented to you, and you go out there and you tell your story. In day to day, you're out there and you're kind of, your entire rhetoric kind of tells your story, who you are, how you present yourself, what everything, what you're dressed like, how you interact with other people, all of that kind of tells your story. And so that's kind of, I'm not going to say every day is a trial. That, perhaps you could argue that, frankly, but that's depends on how you define trial, or like that could just be just very sad and unfortunate, not uplifting, or, but perhaps not the right philosophy to follow, or the right mentality. But for mock trial, I oftentimes would play the defendant, or I would have to talk about my story, and we would show my character, because obviously you want to have, your character has to show values, and obviously you want to show who you are, and if it's your truth, and in mock trial, of course, you're not sneaking around pretending like you're guilty, but trying to get away with something. That's not what mock trial was about. You were honest, you're innocent. The affidavit said your truth, and that was your truth. And obviously, there were loopholes, there were inconsistencies, because everybody saw it differently, and so you weren't guilty trying to get away, it was, you were innocent no matter what. And so, and I think that's actually, human nature almost is like, well, I'm right. This is how it happened. This is what went, like you always think that you are, what's going on. You are correct in your perspective. And you just think, that your testimony is your story. And, and that's kind of, how it goes. But it was kind of, for my trial, obviously, you kind of see the statements, and you see the character analyses, and you only have however long to show who you are, and to explain, this is why you are wrong in thinking that I am guilty of this, or whatever, and for mock trial, it's there's confidence there, obviously, but there's also a certain level of vulnerability, and obviously you might recognize that your testimony does not necessarily have like the beyond reasonable doubt credibility there, or it's that is required for like a guilty sentence, or obviously that's up for debate, of course, but depending on what kind of trial it is or whatever. But beyond a reasonable doubt, are you innocent or guilty? And of course, in this world, there are so many different nuances, so many different like shades of, shades of right and wrong, and like, well, that's that's nuanced for sure. That's definitely like maybe not 100% right or whatever. But in the court of law, if every day is a trial, or if in a trial, they want beyond a reasonable doubt, and if there's evidence, if there's not, whatever, you decide that at the end of the day, or however long it takes. But we were kind of learning about that. We had an attorney come in, and he was kind of telling us about law, and he mentioned, that sometimes bringing up your own flaws, being mindful of those flaws, and just bringing them to the forefront is your power. Because if you don't want to talk about those things, if you don't, recognize that, if you don't recognize that, it's, it could make you look even more guilty if you don't talk about it, or it allows other people to twist it the way that they want to twist it. That's not your story. And there's, your lawyer can, slam them on the on the cross-examination or whatever, and say, blah 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 XYZ, but their lawyers will get you on the cross-examination, and they have the closing statement too, where they can morph anything. And so you have to object when it's objectionable, and say hearsay, and speculation, and things like that. But it kind of talked about bringing up those things, those vulnerabilities, is actually a strength. And I think I agree with that. I know I was thinking about it just now, and, I think that vulnerability, I was thinking about it, and I think that to a certain extent, vulnerability is a power. It is a strength. And I was thinking, that if you don't, if you're never vulnerable, how do you grow? And your relationships where you are vulnerable, I find in my life that the ones where you have been vulnerable, where you are vulnerable, are the ones that stick with you the longest, because there's a certain level of faith and exchange in vulnerability shared. And so I think that that there is a good deal of power in that. And I know I've heard so many people, like talking about take your power back, get your power back. And, like on the internet, when you're completely outside of the scope, outside of the sphere, it's so easy just to take people down with, with their rhetoric and with your rhetoric, and take your power back, and, they're obviously wrong. But that's not true, necessarily, of course. But I just think that, that sometimes that's not, I feel like there's so much, how do I want to say this? There's so much, and I noticed it in the books that I was reading, there's so much emphasis on yourself and your own power, and, your own interests. And I think that the power kind of comes when that falls to the wayside. And so I think that that's kind of interesting, because that's where the friendship is made. That's where, hold on, I have to plug in. So I just think it's it kind of brings up the question of who are you going to allow yourself to be vulnerable with. And, I know in my life, I've not necessarily had a choice who I'm going to be vulnerable with. And I'm sure, most people feel the same. But I think that, I've kind of noticed a trend, and I don't know if it's just, where I'm at or, whatever, but, it's about having power and showing off your power, and not being vulnerable. And I think that detracts from human relations, and it takes away from actual power. And it's I don't know that that's for good, to place that emphasis on that attitude, that mentality of no vulnerability, but it comes down to who you want to be vulnerable with. But, it's very difficult to choose that, and of course that comes down to power as well. But I just thought it was interesting, because, I think that vulnerability is, I even spoke with my therapist about this, just at a session. We're talking about, anxiety and stress related strategies and what have you. But he said, to a certain extent, that vulnerability can be a release, and it can be healthy to just let it go and to just be vulnerable and to let it go. So I think that it's kind of interesting. When are you going to land on that? When are you going to say, and now we can be vulnerable again? When is that actually going to be a strength to my character, to the world's character? Because you can't go around just being a bully the whole time or being in control the whole time. I think that's unsustainable. It's impractical, and it doesn't show a willingness to grow, I think. And so it's just an interesting dynamic to kind of watch throughout the day-to-day interactions. And just where is the narrative going, and when are they going to, when is that release going to, when is that vulnerability going to come into play? How is that going to happen? And so I think that's very interesting. To see it, and the dynamic of who you're going to show your vulnerability to, and when and how, that's obviously a factor. And then there are, of course, ethics in that, and potential valuative questions, and evaluative questions as well. But I feel like it's an interesting dynamic, and I think it's very important to look at when looking at human relations and how society is moving forward and interacting now, to see where it's going to go. And I think that I do think having that level of vulnerability is good and important. And I think that everyone has a right to be vulnerable and to to share in vulnerability. I think it's a good way to move forward, to see where the weakness is, to see where things aren't strong. So just kind of curious what will happen, and where society is going. So yeah, what do you think about your power, about maybe interactions on the internet versus in person? I think vulnerability is so much more when you're in person, obviously. And if it's not, that I've kind of noticed that too. I've noticed a lot less vulnerability in person. And I think that is not a good dynamic. I think that's unhealthy. And I think that's not for good. I think there is a difference between in-person relations and internet relations, and so it's interesting to see how people interact. How do you interact? Are you ever vulnerable with people? Perhaps that you don't know all the time, I'm sure. But how do you protect yourself? And when do you feel like you need to protect yourself? Things like that. It's definitely worth investigating. So, thanks.